Okay. So I was just telling you how I've known Professor Aragi for more than 20 years. And during that time, we have had a lot of fun researching European Union politics. It's one of the things we've been doing. And we've been involved in various projects. We've also been doing other things about national politics and independently, but we've been looking at European Union politics and decision-making in the European Union. And together and separately, we've conducted literally hundreds of semi-structured interviews with the participants in Brussels, officials from the permanent representations of the member states, folks who work in the European Parliament and the European Commission and various interest groups. And we've been trying to figure out who has power in the European Union and how its policy-making process works. And one remarkable thing about our analyses is that we don't talk an awful lot about public opinion. You know, if we were to talk a lot about, the focus of our analysis was policy making at the national level in any of the current 28 member states, we would probably spend a lot of time talking about how public opinion impacts on national policymakers' policy positions and decisions. But when we focus on European Union politics and try to explain its policy-making process, the explanatory factors, the key drivers are quite a few steps removed from public opinion. And there are various reasons for that, which we will explore shortly. But that makes it all the more, this background makes it all the more pleasurable to be here and to talk about this important topic of public opinion and European integration. And broadly speaking, it is a topic that is becoming more and more important in recent years. Not just in the recent year with the Brexit referendum and with various elections in which Eurosceptic parties have gained power and have gained in electoral significance. But looking more broadly between the first decades of the European Union or its predecessors' existence and what's going on now, we see that in the early decades, it was very much an elite-driven project in which there was what we tend to refer to as a permissive consensus. And what we mean by a permissive consensus is that the public essentially said, okay, just go on and do what you think you have to do. And that allowed European elites a large room for maneuver to develop the institutions and the groundwork for what became the European Union that we know today. But that permissive consensus has broken down. The exact dates at which the permissive consensus broke down is subject to some dispute. But certainly, the early signs of it were already clear in the 1990s when there was rising levels of euro-scepticism, and here and there were developments which indicated that perhaps European elites wouldn't have as much room for maneuver as they once had. But certainly we can point to more recent events and say that there have been challenges to European integration, to this permissive consensus as a result of recent developments. The Brexit referendum in the UK last June was obviously a very important development, and we'll spend some time talking about that. The rise of Eurosceptic parties across Europe has been an important development, and Eurosceptic parties of both the left and the right, criticizing the European Union and more broadly the European project from different perspectives, whether on the left it's from an anti-austerity perspective or from the right an anti-immigration perspective. Nonetheless, the rise of these parties have posed a challenge to European level decision makers. The financial crisis of 2008 shook public opinions, the public's confidence in policymakers' ability and capacity to manage the financial system, certainly a crisis of confidence. which had very tangible implications further down the line for the fiscal policies of many European countries. So the financial crisis had knock-on effects for the way in which European citizens view the European project. And we can look a bit further back as well to 2005, when we had the French no outcome in the referendum to ratify the Constitutional Convention. And there we see the example of how arguably European decision makers have responded in quite a problematic way to public opinion. Because what was the response to that? Well, many cynics would say the response wasn't a fundamental change in direction. It was simply a repackaging of the constitutional treaty, taking away some of the rather ephemeral parts of it, taking away the symbolic parts, and essentially implementing that in a slightly different legal way, which circumvented the need for referendum. So these developments show that we're dealing with a big change in the way in which the public at large in Europe view European integration and the European Union in particular. And we're going to look at the Brexit referendum from last year as a case study of what is going on. So why is this an interesting case study? Well, it's one thing to ask people, do you feel European? Do you think your country's membership of the European Union is a good thing? To pose them questions in surveys and to elicit their responses. That's very different from giving them a real choice that will have tangible consequences if the vote goes a particular way. And that's what we had last year in the UK, where people were offered that choice on whether to remain members of the European Union or leave. And as you know, by a slim majority, on the 23rd of June, UK citizens voted to leave the European Union. The morning of the 24th of June was not a good morning for me. It was a real shock. Me and many of my contemporaries thought, how could this happen? What has happened? Few people really saw this coming. The consensus was it was going to be a close vote, but that the Remainers would win the day. So it really shook our confidence in our ability to make accurate forecasts of these kinds of plebiscites. And of course, later that year, we had the Trump election, and the confidence in political forecasting was further undermined. But let's look at some hard evidence on how people voted in the June 2016 referendum to try to get a handle on what the causes and motivations of this decision were. So who voted remain, who voted leave, how are they distinguished from each other, both in terms of what we would generally think of as being quite objective characteristics of people, things that you can really sometimes see and measure with a great deal of certainty, like their age, their income, their education, but also in terms of more subjective factors like their general attitudes and values. How do the Remainers and the Leavers differ? And I think this provides some insight into the causes, at least, of variation in public opinion on European integration. So let's first just look at some long-term data on, that shows a gentle rise in the level of euro-scepticism in the UK. So these data are taken from various sources that have been gathered together, and they are, I believe, the best available data that we have on public opinion on and political behaviour on the UK, in the UK, and specifically in the referendum last year. So what that shows is a gentle rise in the percentage of people who said that they wanted to leave the European Union. But what's remarkable is that even in 2015, the blue line, which is the percentage of the blue bar here, which is the percentage of people who really firmly said they wanted to leave the EU, were still in a minority. And the pink bar were the folks who wanted to stay in the EU but reduce its power. So they were euro-sceptics, but they weren't leavers. So something happened during the referendum that turned these euro-sceptic remainers into leavers. Let's look in a little bit more depth at the characteristics of the people who voted to leave. In terms of sex, they tended to be slightly more male. 54% of men voted to leave, while 49% of women voted to leave. But that's not a big difference compared to some of the other differences that we see here. So age was a very big factor. Among the 18 to 34-year-olds, only 40% voted to leave. Now, I still think that's quite high, but compare that to the 65-plussers, 61% of whom voted to leave. So support for leaving is a more elderly phenomenon. And what I want to sort of also instill upon you, I should have said that at the start, what I want to kind of instill upon you is that, from your perspective, sitting in the south of Europe, you read about the UK leaving the European Union, you think, my goodness, all those British people, what are they thinking? But the idea I want to instill in you is that there's a lot of variation within British public opinion, and among people like you in the UK, so young, highly educated, international, those people also think this is a terrible decision. And indeed, you could think of what's going to happen in the next 10, 20, 30 years in your lifetime. Well, the 65-plussers, most of them are going to be dead. So things will change, of course, once the UK has left the European Union, and who knows how that will impact upon public opinion. But you could imagine this cohort of 18 to 34-year-olds growing up, not changing their opinion all that much, and then in 20 or 30 years, who knows? You may have another UK application to join the European Union when people like you will be in power. You'll have to figure out what to do. But age is certainly a big part of this. Urban and rural, not much difference there. It's not really an urban or a rural phenomena. Education is a big driver of support for leaving the EU. So people with a degree, only 26% of them voted to leave, but people with no qualifications, 78%. I still think this is quite high, the folks with a degree, 26% who wants to leave. And among my students, in the run-up to the referendum, I had like a straw poll in some of my classes. I was amazed at the big minority of people who were considering voting leave. So there's variation that's accounted for partly by these objective characteristics and partly by some subjective characteristics that we'll look at in the next slide. But income as well, people who are doing less well financially are more likely to vote for leave than fat cats, in general. So if you look only at these data, if you were to look only at these sort of objectifiable characteristics, you might think, oh, well, the folks who voted leave, they are, uneducated, old, and poor. And there's some truth to that. There's some truth to that, but it's a bit more complex. There's variation by region. So up in the north, where I live, only a minority of people voted to leave, as you probably know. Northern Ireland, a minority voted to leave. But in England and Wales as a whole, we have majorities in favour of leaving. But even here, still quite a lot of variation. And in London, the cosmopolitan capital, only 40% of folks voted to leave. So there's a lot of variation by region as well as by individual characteristics. And this is another, I find quite interesting, set of characteristics on which leavers and remainers tend to differ. And that's more about their fundamental values, which are only partly correlated with their socioeconomic positions. A relatively recent development in the study of public opinion is to say, well, these terms of left and right that we've used to describe and summarize people's political opinions for decades, they are becoming less and less relevant. They're being interpreted in new ways. Sometimes they are being supplemented with additional dimensions of disagreement and difference. Sometimes they are being reinterpreted in various political systems. And a very important idea is this idea of differences between people in terms of their attitudes towards authority. And there's a whole kind of theory behind this called the difference between green, authoritarian, libertarian, and traditional values. And this is one little part of this. And what it shows is that people who have more authoritarian dispositions, so they have attitudes that are all about authority, in favor of authority and order in the world, they are far more likely to be in favor of leaving than people who are fundamentally more libertarian and freewheeling in their approach to life. So this is a way of distinguishing between people in terms of their attitudes to authority more generally. It doesn't ask them about anything to do with their positions on European integration. It's actually asking them about their attitudes on issues that have to do with the use and justification for the use of authority in social relations. And people who are broadly more authoritarian in their views, far higher percentage of those folks voted to leave than people who were neither authoritarian nor libertarian or who were libertarian. So that says there's something more subjective, something more to do with people's subjective values that influence the way they voted. Also, their general attitudes toward welfare. People who were anti-welfare were more likely to vote to leave than people who were pro-welfare. So you might think, well, the poor and relatively uneducated, they would be the type of people who would generally have to use welfare more often. You might think. And those were the folks who voted to leave. But what this is telling us is that there's something else going on as well. People's attitudes towards welfare, and in particular a very negative attitude towards welfare and the welfare state in general, is associated with support for leaving the EU. This is also really interesting, this little nugget of information down here. What it shows is that the people who did not vote in the 2015 election, the people who were kind of disaffected with politics but then voted in the referendum, they were far more likely to vote to leave than the people who voted in 2015. So it doesn't matter what type of people they are, just whether or not they showed up in 2015. So that suggests that the Leave campaign managed to mobilize people who were previously not engaged with politics. So what we're getting is a bit of a more nuanced picture on what is going on if we consider these more kind of objective socioeconomic characteristics, the subjective values, the regions. We find that there's actually one way of thinking about the coalition that voted to remain and those that voted to leave is that this coalition is composed of distinct groups. So this is kind of the stereotypical leave voter. Economically deprived, anti-immigration, and sure, this section of the population voted overwhelmingly to leave the EU. Older working class, again, that's the kind of cliche, they voted to leave as well. But this group here, the folks who kind of live in the home counties in England, relatively affluent, small c conservative in orientation, probably quite anti-immigrant as well, but certainly very different from this group of people in terms of how economically well they're doing in life. These people voted by a large margin to leave as well. And then you have another section of what you might in a sort of rather antiquated way call the working class, but younger working class Labour voters, about 25% of the population, they voted overwhelmingly to remain, as did the middle class Liberals. They voted overwhelmingly to remain as well. So we have a diverse group of people voting to leave. And it starts to give us a sense of the idea that explaining people's orientation towards the European Union is a tricky business. And we need to take into account different factors, some of which are objective, some of which are subjective, some of which are about the region and location and context in which people are embedded. And that's, of course, just taking a step back from the UK and looking to our nearest neighbour is also relevant there, where we see quite substantial regional variation in France in the first round of the French presidential elections a couple of weeks ago, where one of the issues was certainly tied up with EU membership, where Le Pen has taken a very Eurosceptic position. Macron has also taken a softer Eurosceptic position, but nonetheless that dimension of difference is also present in our nearest neighbour in France. And then looking more broadly again across the EU, the best, but some people would say still not very good, evidence that we have available on European public opinion, more broadly on the European Union, is from the Eurobarometer. And the Eurobarometer is great in some ways, and it's limited in other ways. It's great in that it covers the whole of Europe. It's a nice random sample in each of the European Union's member states on a regular basis. Where it's a little bit more problematic is that it's run by the European Commission. It's not really run by social scientists. I'm sure the European Commission consults social scientists when they're designing their study. And in many ways, it's a great project. But what they tend to do is they tend to change the question words. And what we're going to see is that, well, actually the way in which you ask people about their attitudes to the European Union is very sensitive to exactly what you ask them. Whether you ask them specifically about the European Union as an institution, whether you ask them about Europe in general, whether you ask them whether their membership of the EU is a good thing, whether you ask them about whether they like what's happening in Europe now or whether you want the speed of integration to speed up or slow down in the future, all these things, you don't get really the same answers. And sometimes you have a sense, maybe I'm being excessively cynical here, but you get a sense that sometimes when politician bureaucrats don't like the answers they get, they just change the question. So there's a very famous question about, do you think your country's membership of the European Union is a good thing? We had nice data on that going back. And they stopped asking this question. So we don't really know. We don't have any great amount of certainty just now about public opinion on this very important question because they stopped asking the question, which is a terrible thing. But they have, notwithstanding these quibbles, this shows that we have variation to explain. There's a lot of differences, even just at the country level, between the 28 member states in terms of the percentage of people who feel attached to the European Union. On average, it's 51%. That's kind of skating on thin ice here. So it's a very slim majority of European citizens who, across the 28 member states, feel attached to the EU. And that varies incredibly. You know, down, it won't surprise you to hear, the Greeks in particular are not particularly attached to the European Union at this stage, while the Luxembourgish are terribly attached to it. So there's variation within countries and across countries as well. Where's Spain on this? 58%, not bad. Now you ask the question a little bit different. You ask them about not attachment to the European Union, but to Europe. And as you would expect, more people are likely to say they're attached to Europe than the European Union. You know, they might not feel any affinity to these political institutions, but a more abstract idea of Europe is more appealing. You know, I feel European, even if I don't really care for the Commission and the Council and the European Parliament. So on average, 61% of European citizens feel attached to Europe. And what is kind of interesting is that there's some correlation here, but there's some interesting differences. So you'll note here Sweden is right at the top here. 77% of Swedes feel European. But if we look at the previous slide on their attachment to the European Union, only 47%. So that's really a big difference. For some countries that difference is smaller, and for some countries that's bigger. So in some countries there's a real difference in people's minds between the EU and Europe, and in other countries they're kind of more or less the same thing for people. So this does raise some fundamental questions here. You know, when we think about Brexit and our analysis of what's going on, what has gone on within the UK, when we look at you know, election results for parties that are clearly distinguishable in terms of their positions on the European Union, when we look at data that compares public opinion across Europe on people's general attitudes to the EU, the fundamental questions this raises are, well, what does public support for European integration really mean? What does it mean to be in favor of the EU or to support the EU when we ask it in all kind of different ways? That's a question that I can already tell you I don't have the answer to it, and I don't think there is an answer. There's not any one answer to it. Why does it vary across individuals and European countries? And then moving to the next part, what kind of linkage would we want to see, and what kind do we see between variation in public opinion and European Union policies and politics? So the concept of support for European integration, one question, and as I said, there's no right or wrong answer to this, is whether it is fundamentally unidimensional or multidimensional. Now, it's very easy to say, oh, things are so complicated, of course it's multidimensional. That's kind of an easy way of, I think quite a lazy way of thinking about difficult concepts. Because if you think about things that are far bigger than just the European Union, people's general attitudes towards the role of the state in society are summarized pretty well by the left-right dimension. You know, and it's very humbling in a way. You know, we think of ourselves as holding all these nuanced views because we've read lots of books. But in fact, a lot of our opinions can be summarized pretty neatly on a single dimension. And this is this left-right dimension which you probably are able to place yourself somewhere on a left-right, a unidimensional left-right dimension to summarize where you stand in political debate in general. And that's true not only of you, that's true of you know, decades of research on public opinion in many countries, many advanced democracies. So before we jump to the conclusion that support for the EU is so complicated that we definitely need multiple dimensions, just contemplate the fact that a lot of our opinions can be summarized very neatly just using one dimension. So having said that, there are people who say there are different aspects to it. Let's call them aspects for the time being, and putting aside the question of whether we really need different dimensions. But there are certainly different aspects to it. And there's some evidence that people's attitudes towards the European Union do require attention to these different aspects. And there's a study up there, and the detailed source is in the bibliography to this presentation. But one aspect of support is performance. So what you think about the EU in terms of the policies it delivers, in terms of its level of transparency, whether or not you think that the EU performs well as a political system. That's one aspect of support for European integration. Another is more utilitarian. That's more about what you think you get personally for your country more broadly, or what the EU delivers in terms of real tangible gains for European citizens. That's a more sort of cost-benefit way of thinking about support for European integration. Then we have the identity. Now that's more the I feel European. You know, we have a common history and culture together. It's part of who I am. That's another dimension or aspect. Let's call them aspects. Aspect of support for the EU. Then there's a more emotional response. And political scientists have only really started to grapple with emotions as a distinct aspect of people's responses to politics. But people do have a sort of visceral response to the European Union. Some people feel really excited, almost in love with the European Union. Others are really disgusted. If you're somebody who it doesn't really do much to you, it's kind of maybe hard for you to imagine that people are so affected by it. But if you ask people about their questions about whether they feel disgust or anger or real affection for the EU, that is a distinct aspect of their support that doesn't correlate entirely with the others. And then we have this final one, which is about strengthening. So we tend to ask people mainly about what they think about how the European Union is today, whether you like it or not. But a distinct aspect of people's support is about what they think should happen in the future. Should it be sped up, slowed down? So you can imagine that you have two people who both think the EU is a great institution, and one of them thinks, but it's fine the way it is. We don't need any more integration. And then you have another person who says, same level of enthusiasm for the current state of affairs, but really wants things to progress and integrate even further. There's probably less variation between the strengthening dimension for people who are euro-sceptic. They probably all want the EU to to decrease in powers in years to come. So what explains variation in support when we look more broadly? So we looked in particular at variation in support within the context of the Brexit vote. And this is really, we find the same story, which is sometimes why case studies are so useful. We find the same story in the cross-national research. So individuals' socioeconomic positions are a very important explanation of the level of support for EU membership, for the European Union, regardless of how specifically we measure it. So people who are more educated, people who are younger, they tend to be more in favor of the European Union, and that makes perfect sense because, well, those are the people who benefit most from being able to travel across borders. And the people who are maybe more economically disadvantaged, they at least perceive more challenges, labor market challenges from EU integration. The size of countries' net benefits is an important explanatory variable. It's not the only thing. And these are benefits not only in terms of European subsidies coming into areas, but also think of the high levels of support in a country like Luxembourg, which is very much benefiting from EU membership as a small, relatively open country trading with its neighbours. People's left-right positions combined with the size of the national welfare state, so that the evidence does show that there's some impact here of people's general left-right position, their general orientation with respect to the role of state in society and in managing the economy, but that effect varies depending on whether they are in a country with a big welfare state. If you're in a country with a big welfare state, then people of the left generally perceive the European Union to be a threat and are less inclined to be as supportive of further integration, whereas people on the left in countries with very modest welfare states in terms of size and benefits, they are more likely to be in favor of the EU. Identity, so this gets back to our subjective factors, and cues from the media. So one of the things about the EU is that people don't really know an awful lot about it. People in general don't know a lot about national politics either. But once you start asking them about the European Union, any level of detail, you usually get complete blanks. And when people don't know much about a subject, they look for cues. They look for people and institutions to help them figure out what they should think. And these cues are provided by the media. They're provided by mainstream and challenger political parties. So the idea is really that, I suppose to put it another way, people who study public opinion are actually quite skeptical of whether the public actually have any opinions. We're not sure that they actually have any opinions at all, other than the opinions that they've been told to, or some would say even manipulated to formulate. So where do they get these opinions? Democracy and as with all political systems, requires some leadership. And this leadership is supplied by various institutions, could be the media, could be political parties. So these are very important actors in defining what people think. Now, how long do we have still? 5 minutes? How long can you stand still? Okay. I want to skip over these slides because I think that we're now getting to the stage where we've kind of said what I want to say about public opinion. And then the next part of it is, well, what are the effects of this on the way in which decisions are taken within the European Union. And there is, at a very broad level, a correlation. And this is a nice piece of work done by Dimitar Toshkov in 2011. I should say, lots of people have studied public opinion on the European Union because we have Eurobarometer, because we have national election studies, we have data that tells us this. And so that's why there's a lot of research. Wherever you find data and information, you find research. But there's less research that has been done on the impact of public opinion on what the European Union does. This is one of the exceptions to that, which is why I'm bothering to show it to you. What it shows is that at a very general level, if we look at the change in public support, which is the black line, change in levels of public support over time, we see that sort of goes up sharply in the mid-90s and then goes down again. And then we find that legislative output, so the total amount, the total count of how busy the European Union is, that kind of goes up and down, not in perfect sync, but there's some relationship between those two things. So at a very broad brush, abstract level, some people would argue there is a correlation, a correspondence between public opinion and what the EU does. But I'd say that that's pretty abstract. Just looking at the total percent support for the EU across a very large number of diverse countries and the total count of how busy the European Union is in terms of its legislative output. It's interesting to know, but when we look at the detail, the qualitative substance of what the European Union does in terms of its laws, it's difficult to say, oh, this law here or what the EU did here really followed from a public demand. And why is that? Well, I think the key is somewhere in these different factors. Consider what policy areas are of primary concern to the European Union. The bulk of what the European Union does is to regulate markets, set common standards for products and services, funding, modest amount of funding, small percentage of EU GDP for research, agriculture and conservation, and importantly for the Eurozone countries, interest rates, monetary policy and fiscal constraints. I'm not saying this is all the EU does, but those are the main things. Now, contrast that with the main things that are of concern to citizens. What do people really care about? What do people really care about in terms of their politics? Well, they really care about health, education, welfare, law enforcement, and the taxes that are required to do these things. Those are the big things that people care about. So there's a disjoint. There's a massive difference between what the EU does and the policy areas that people really care about. Now, it's true that the EU does do some stuff in each of these areas. You know, it does a bit of corporation tax, the Erasmus exchange, we all love the Erasmus program, great program, you know, helps young people meet each other in different countries, we love that. But it's not really the bulk of education in terms of the investment that national and subnational governments put into primary, secondary education and universities. The EU tinkers around the edges of these areas. So that explains why there's a big disjoint between public opinion and what the EU does. And then if we think about the actors, or institutions as they're sometimes referred to in the EU, the European Commission, the European Council and the European Parliament, these are institutions that are quite far removed from people's experience of politics. The European Commission is generally perceived as being quite a bureaucratic actor. The European Council, where our national governments go and represent us, is quite a baroque organization. It's not just you have one European Council, you have a different set of ministers meeting depending on the policy area. and a lot of the work is even done by officials at the working group level. So it's actually quite a complex organization. And then you have the European Parliament, which, as you know, is a directly elected body, but it's typically a second-order election. So in many respects, elections to the European Parliament look more like local elections than national elections. The turnout is lower. People tend to vote as if they were voting in a protest way. So when we look at the institutions and what the EU does, this explains why it's only weakly responsive. This is where my presentation gets really boring, and intentionally so. I want to show you why it's so boring what the EU does. I said to the start, Dr. Arregui and I have done plenty of interviews. We have a very high boredom threshold, really. So they argue about things like the size of the intervention price for sugar, where Dr. Arregui and I systematically mapped out what the issue was and what each of the member states wanted. Here's one of the more exciting ones, which was about establishing a market for carbon credits in the aviation sector. Very kind of nitty-gritty, detailed issues on which member states took legitimately different positions, but these positions were determined mainly by sectoral interests, not big, exciting left-right differences. So, this was about the structure of the aviation sector and levels of pollution, all very important, but not the sort of thing that's going to keep your average citizen awake at night. The council is where power lies. So I won't bore you with the analysis that led to this, but if we look at the relative power of the institutions, the best model, the best predictor, assumes that almost all of the power is held by the council. And what that indicates is that, well, if we're going to understand politics in the European Union, we better understand the configuration of member states' positions in the council. And what this table says is, so don't bother looking at the table, I'll just tell you what it says, is that if we look at how member states line up in the council, they hardly ever line up as you would expect based on their left-right positions. So at the national level, left and right, that's a big deal. That means something. But when we get to the European level, that big dimension of politics that structures how we understand political discourse is just almost irrelevant. Which explains why there's this disjoint between how public opinion and the EU. So, as I said, the main explanation of how member states line up is not their left-right positions. It's quite detailed sectoral interests that are associated with the decision that's on the agenda. So this kind of raises some bigger questions that I'm going to leave you with. And that's really, well, what kind of a linkage would we want to see between public opinion and European integration? And it's part of a more general question, which is what kind of linkage would we want to see between public opinion and public policies? So one of the things that people do when they start critiquing the European Union, as they definitely should critique the European Union, every political system should be challenged. But one of the traps that we don't want to fall into is that we are holding the European Union to different standards, without thinking about it, than we would hold our national political systems. So what kind of linkage would we want to see between public opinion and public policies at the national level? And given that, what would we want to see at the European level? And also bearing in mind that we have fundamentally different theories of democratic representation. And some of these theories are quite simplistic in the sense that they posit that there is such a thing as the general interest, the general will, and that should simply be transferred somehow into public opinion. But a more intricate pluralist model of democratic representation says, well, there's no such thing as the will of the people. There's just a plurality of different opinions, and that political systems have to be there, have to be developed in order to provide as unbiased as possible filters for deciding between these different interests. So some of the big questions, which if we have time, this will depend on how generous Dr. Arrighi is feeling, but the big questions this leaves us is, well, does the EU have a democratic deficit? Or, as some would say, a democratic surplus? It might sound odd when you always hear about the EU's democratic deficit to mention the possibility that it has a democratic surplus, but it is very sensitive in some ways to the smallest of changes in public opinion. You know, 1 of 28 member states votes by a very, very narrow majority to leave the EU, and the whole system is disrupted completely, as we see in recent months. That's not an unresponsive system, if we view it like that. So if it does have a democratic deficit or a surplus, what are the main elements of it? And what assumptions do we make, usually implicitly, when we argue that it has a democratic deficit? And the third big question is, if there is a democratic deficit, what is it feasible to do in response to that? Is it something that's inevitable, or are there realistic changes that we could make to the system to address that deficit?